Hi everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a gripping story full of tension, family conflict, and an unexpected storm that brings more than just rain. Follow James and Diep as they fight to protect their love, their land, and each other against the powerful forces threatening to tear them apart. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. The wind was howling. James stood by the wooden fence, eyes narrowed at the dark sky swirling above the hills. "It's coming," he muttered. Diep walked out from the shed, her hands still covered in soil. "I know, I've covered the herb beds and tied the mango trees," she said, brushing hair from her face. The storm was unlike any they had seen in years. For months, James and Diep had poured their energy into rebuilding the old farm. The days were long but peaceful. Evenings were quiet, filled with laughter and home-cooked meals. For the first time, they felt like they were building something real, together. But peace doesn't last forever. By late afternoon, the wind had turned savage. Tin roofs rattled, loose branches flew. James grabbed the last tarp and secured it over the goat pen while Diep ran to gather the chickens into their coop. Just as she locked the gate, a sharp branch flew and scraped her arm. "Diep!" James rushed over, pulling her toward the house. The power cut out just as they got inside. The old farmhouse creaked under the pressure of the wind. Rain slammed against the windows like fists. They lit candles and huddled close. "We'll be okay," James said softly. "We've survived worse." But outside, something else was coming. By morning, the storm had passed. Trees were uprooted, and parts of the fence lay flat on the muddy ground. But they were alive, together. Diep smiled through exhaustion, leaning into James as they surveyed the damage. Then a car engine roared in the distance. A black SUV pulled up the driveway, tires crunching over gravel. James stiffened immediately. "No," he whispered. The door opened, and a tall woman stepped out in heels, far too polished for this muddy ground. Her red coat flapped in the breeze like a flag of war. "Me," James said through clenched teeth. Bartui looked around with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. "So this is where you've decided to rot?" she said coldly. Then her eyes fell on Diep. "You must be her." Diep stood her ground, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ciao, ciao, bash." But the older woman wasn't interested in pleasantries. "I warned you, James. I told you this girl would ruin you. And now look at this dump. You used to wear suits. You used to talk about investment portfolios. Now you're playing farmer with a peasant?" "That's enough," James snapped. "You don't get to come here and insult the woman I love." Bartui smirked. "Love? Love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't rebuild a name. And love won't save you when you've destroyed your future." "I don't want your version of the future," he said. "I chose Diep. I chose this life." Her eyes turned cold. "Then you've made your bed." She turned and left. But before stepping into the car, she looked back at Diep. "He may be too blind to see what you are, but I'm not." The SUV sped off, leaving a trail of dust and tension behind. That night, the air inside the house was thicker than the rain-soaked air outside. James sat by the fireplace, poking at the embers with a stick, lost in thought. Diep quietly bandaged the cut on her arm, the silence between them sharp like broken glass. "You okay?" he finally asked. She nodded. "It's just a scratch." "I meant about my mother." Diep took a breath. "She doesn't scare me, James, but I'm worried about you. I've never seen you so angry." He stared into the fire. "I cut ties with her 2 years ago. She tried to bribe me into marrying someone else, someone with status. When I said no, she threatened to disown me, and she did. And now she's back," Diep said gently. "Why?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But she doesn't just visit. She schemes." At that moment, a loud knock echoed at the door. James stood up immediately. "Stay here," he whispered. He opened the door cautiously, revealing a young man in a black raincoat holding a package. "Delivery for Mr. James?" James frowned. "In the middle of the night?" The man shrugged. "Paid extra for same-day express?" He handed James a small box, nodded, and walked off. James closed the door, staring at the box. No name, no note, just a crimson ribbon tied in a neat bow. Diep walked over, curiosity on her face. "What is it?" James slowly untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside was a single object, a gold ring. Elegant, expensive, and familiar. "It's my father's signet ring," he whispered. "He buried it with his will. No one should have this." A cold chill ran down Diep's spine. "James, I think your mother's not just angry. She's planning something." He nodded. "I think she already started." James placed the ring on the table and leaned back, his jaw clenched. "She's not here just to insult us, Diep. She wants control. She always has." Diep touched his arm gently. "Then we don't let her. This is our life, not hers." James looked at her, eyes full of emotion. "You make me stronger. I just hope that strength is enough." Suddenly a buzzing sound interrupted them. James's phone lit up. A text message from an unknown number. "If you really care about her, send her away, before it's too late." Diep read it over his shoulder, her fingers tightening around his. "This isn't just her, is it?" James shook his head slowly. "No, someone else is helping her." The fire crackled louder now, as if echoing the tension in the room. Outside, the wind had calmed, but inside, something dangerous was beginning to take form. Diep stood up, calm but resolute. "Then let them come. I'm not afraid." And from the shadows, unseen by both of them, a figure stood near the edge of the woods, watching the house, waiting for nightfall. That night, the storm returned fiercer than ever. The wind roared like a beast, slamming against the walls of the house. Trees bent under the force of the rain, and thunder cracked so loud it rattled the windows. James had gone into town to meet an old friend, promising Diep he would be back before dark. But darkness had come early. Diep sat alone in the living room, curled under a thick blanket, a mug of tea growing cold on the table. She tried to read, but her eyes kept flicking to her phone. No signal. The countryside always did this during storms. But something felt different tonight, like the house was holding its breath. And then it came. A knock at the door. She froze. Who would come in weather like this? Slowly, she approached. "Who's there?" No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Not a knock, a pound. Her breath caught. She didn't open it. Instead, she backed away and grabbed her phone again. Still no signal. Then the lights flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness. Suddenly, glass shattered in the back of the house. She spun around, heart racing. Someone had broken a window. Diep grabbed the fireplace poker and backed toward the stairs. Footsteps echoed through the hallway. Then a man emerged from the shadows, masked and dressed in black. Before she could scream, he lunged at her, knocking the poker from her hands and slamming her against the wall. Another figure followed, taller, stronger, who held her arms behind her back as the first punched her hard in the stomach. She cried out in pain, collapsing to the floor. "Make it quick," the tall one said coldly. "Scare her good. That's what we were paid for." She gasped. "Who sent you?" No answer, but before they could move again, the front door burst open. James stood in the doorway, soaked in rain, eyes wide with horror. "Diep!" He charged in, tackling one of the men to the ground. They struggled violently, knocking over furniture. The second intruder tried to run, but James kicked him back. The masked man scrambled out the broken window and disappeared into the storm. James turned just in time to see the other man slipping through the trees. He didn't chase. He rushed to Diep, who was crumpled on the floor, coughing blood. "Baby, stay with me. I've got you." Later, at the hospital, Diep lay in a sterile white room, hooked up to machines. The doctor had said she was lucky. No internal organ damage, but 2 fractured ribs, heavy bruising, and severe shock. James hadn't left her side. When she stirred, her voice was faint. "What happened?" "You're safe now," he whispered, brushing hair from her forehead. "I'm here." She tried to sit up, winced, then whispered, "They said they were paid to scare me." James clenched his fists. He had a feeling he knew who was behind it. The door creaked open. His mother, Batui, stepped in. Elegant as always, her lipstick perfect, her expression unreadable. She looked at Diep for a moment, then turned to her son. "I heard what happened," she said. James stood. "If you're here to pretend you care, don't." "I came to check on you," she replied. "Although I warned you, James, that girl brings trouble." James's eyes narrowed. "She was attacked in our home." "You think that's her fault?" "Sometimes trouble follows those who don't belong," she said coldly, then added, "I hope this shows you how dangerous it is for her to stay." Diep whispered, "It was you." Batui raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? You sent them, or paid someone to? I don't get my hands dirty, sweetheart, but I do what's necessary to protect my son." James stepped between them. "You crossed the line. If you ever go near her again." His mother smirked. "What will you do, James? Walk away from the family? From everything we built?" "I already did," he said firmly. "The night I chose her." Batui's smile vanished. She gave one final look, then turned and walked out. James sat beside Diep again, took her hand gently. She winced at the touch, but didn't let go. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have been home." "It's not your fault," she said, "but I won't let her win. I'm not leaving." "I won't let you," James replied. "Not now, not ever." They sat in silence, the machines beeping softly around them, the storm slowly dying outside. But they both knew this was only the beginning. As dawn broke, light filtered through the hospital windows, painting pale gold across Diep's bandaged face. James hadn't slept a minute. His eyes were red, jaw clenched as he stared out the window, his thoughts a whirlwind of rage and helplessness. The door opened again. This time it was Lan, Diep's childhood friend, rushing in with teary eyes. "Oh my God, Diep!" she cried, rushing to the bed. Diep smiled weakly, then winced. "She's okay," James said, voice low. But barely. Lan looked from Diep to James, then asked, Do the police know? James shook his head. They're investigating, but there's nothing solid yet. No fingerprints. No security footage. It's like they vanished. Lan turned pale. This wasn't random, was it? James nodded grimly. They said they were paid. This was meant to send a message. Diep reached for James's hand. But we won't be scared off. Lan's eyes burned with fury. Then let me help. Whatever you need, contacts, money, even protection, I'll do it. James looked at her with gratitude. Thank you. That afternoon, James made a quiet call to a private investigator he knew from his darker days, someone discreet, effective, and loyal. Find out who touched my wife, he said, voice sharp as steel. I want names, I want proof, and I want it fast. You got it, came the voice on the other end. James hung up and returned to Diep's side, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. She stirred and opened her eyes, a faint smile forming. We're going to fight this, he whispered. Not just survive, but win. Diep's eyes glimmered with quiet strength. Together. In a remote countryside, James and Diep live a peaceful life in their rustic home, surrounded by nature and love. But a violent storm disrupts their tranquility, forcing them to take shelter and protect what they hold dear. As the rain pours outside, a more dangerous force brews inside. Batui, James's controlling mother, arrives unannounced. Her presence escalates tension, and an argument quickly turns violent. Batui, determined to tear them apart, strikes Diep and leaves her unconscious in the mud. James, torn between loyalty and rage, rushes Diep to the hospital while a dark cloud of guilt and pain looms over them. In the aftermath, the couple is left broken not by the storm, but by the betrayal within. Episode 1 sets the emotional and suspenseful tone for what's to come.